Our next speaker is Nancy Young. She is a professor of history at the University of Houston. She's a historian of 20th century American political development, specializing in the Congress, the presidency, electoral politics, and first ladies. Nancy Young joined the esteemed faculty at the University of Houston in 2007 after teaching 10 years at McNeary College in Illinois. I would now like to take this opportunity to give the floor to Nancy Young.
Thank you for having me here on this lovely winter Saturday afternoon, Saturday morning, because this is a good winter day in Texas. Summer in South Bend, winter in Texas, because you don't want our summers. So our talks, without any advanced planning, I think fit together nicely. I'm going to cover essentially the same range of years. I'm going to go back a little farther in time, and I'm going to come at the issue of income inequality, citizenship, and politics from more of a political perspective. Voting did not look like it had done any good. It seemed like it went their way anyhow. This is what a Lamar County, Texas sharecropper said in the early 20th century. So he just gave up. The thing that's most interesting about this sharecropper to me, who gave up on voting, is that he gave up on the Socialist Party, which in the early 20th century in Texas was the party that was most likely to run second, not a close second, far second, from the Democratic Party. The Republican Party was so non-existent in Texas that the Socialist Party was probably the party that was going to come closest. And this sharecropper did not see any hope for himself in the Democratic Party, saw hope in the Socialist Party, but it didn't look like any socialists were ever going to get elected, and they didn't. So he gave up. He didn't talk about income inequality in the way that we do today. This phrase is a modern concept. When I was preparing this talk, I also went to the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary. I had to laugh when you went to it for definitions. I went to it as well. And I looked up the definition of poverty, and according to the OED, poverty means destitution, the condition of having little or no wealth, few material possessions, indigence, and destitution. Citizenship, I also got from the OED, means the position or status of being a citizen. And I want you to think about what is entailed with being a citizen. As a legal status, it's synonymous with nationality. Citizenship typically confers the right to live and work in a particular nation state and to participate in its politics. And I think that's the key phrase there, and to participate in its politics while being subject to taxation. So those are the OED definitions. The OED also defines phrases, some phrases, but it does not define income inequality, which I find interesting. I'm sure that editors are working on that concept. They certainly need to, I think. And income inequality compared with poverty, I think, is a much more politically charged term. We have trouble defining income inequality. Does it just mean the gap in my wages compared with my teaching assistant's wages? Is that all that it means? I don't think so. I think it means more than that. Economists say that if you just define the gap in one person's wages compared with another person's wages, then you're leaving out lots of other factors that can affect how a person is able to live his or her life. You're leaving out the impact of taxation. You're leaving out the impact of a whole host of income transfers like Social Security payments, food stamps, student loans, Pell Grants, and a host of other sorts of income transfer programs. Experts also note that earnings metrics do not account for wage fluctuation over time. So some 25 years ago, I was one of those underpaid teaching assistants, and now I'm a tenured college professor. So my wages have fluctuated with time. Most people's wages do fluctuate with time. Some of them it's more of an undulation where there are the downs as well as the ups as they proceed onward. That's not a good thing. But just the wage gap does not account for that. It also does not account for credit and how much access do you have for credit. Do you have a really good FICO credit score, and can you go out and get a mortgage at the most competitive interest rate possible? Can you get a 15-year fixed as opposed to a 30-year fixed? Do you need to rely on some sort of strange mortgage where the interest rates might change on you after so many years? You know, what's your situation with regard to credit? Can you get a credit card? Do you have to worry about buying an airplane ticket to go to a conference, such as my graduate student who was in my office yesterday afternoon, who was kind of concerned that she couldn't go to this conference this summer because she doesn't have room on her credit card to buy her airplane ticket. And we talked through some strategies, so I think she's going to make it to the conference. But access to credit is hugely significant in where we stand beyond what we make. Some measures, some economists say that measures of household wealth get closer to the truth because household wealth incorporates inherited wealth or the lack thereof. So if you have inherited wealth, that puts you in a very different position than if you are a first-generation college student, if your entree into college is through a community college as opposed to being a trust fund baby at Yale or Harvard or Notre Dame or wherever the trust fund babies might be. And if you have such a large trust fund, you may not work, but you have a large income from the trust fund. So wage gaps don't take that into account. Wage gaps also don't take into the account that striving individuals, the sacrifices that striving individuals make to pull themselves out of poverty. So if you were not a trust fund baby, but you don't want to continue to be poor in whatever neighborhood you might have grown up in, then you're going to have to make some sacrifices. You're probably going to have to take on some student debt to go through college and all such as that. And so you may have a good paying job, but you might also be paying $3,000 a month. I'm making up a figure there. I hope I'm making up a figure there. But paying $3,000 a month in student loan payments for your medical school degree as well as everything else. So you might look wealthy from the perspective of your paycheck, but once you add in student loans and childcare and all the rest of it, you're not quite as wealthy as the colleague next door who's a trust fund baby. So there are all these complicated factors that shape income inequality beyond what you make and what you don't make. Okay. That said, I want to roll back in time again and start looking at income inequality and poverty and political participation from a historical perspective. I'm going to paint a rather bleak picture, I think, and I want to start with a question that the popular writer and journalist Thomas Frank asked in his book, What's the Matter with Kansas, about a dozen years or so ago. Mr. Frank was concerned with why voters in Kansas, but you could have extrapolated his argument to any other state or region or locality where there were a higher number of lower income citizens and voters than not. And what he wanted to know was why these lower income people were voting for a political party consistently that did not endorse policies that favored the position of said lower income voters. And so he digs into that in his What's the Matter with Kansas book. Historians have also addressed the question in a more academic way, and one of the better written historical books that I would recommend to you if you're interested is by a woman, Bethany Morton, To Serve God in Walmart. And her book is quite fascinating. She looks at how and why evangelical Christians have voted for and encouraged the free market, free trade, free enterprise agenda of the Republican Party, often at the expense of the expanding welfare state protections that would have benefited their own communities. Whereas Frank took this incredulous tone, how dare you, that was sort of looking down the nose at the same people he was sort of trying to help, kind of in a Roger Moore, yes, I was trying to name him Michael for some reason.
It is Michael.
It is Michael Moore. Okay, yes, Roger and me. Yes. So Frank has this incredulous tone. Morton comes to her subjects on their own terms. She does what every good historian is taught to do, and she takes her subjects at face value and tries to understand them based on the lives that they lived without saying, how dare you, to them in her words. And she shows how there were more factors shaping her subject's political worldview than economics. She shows how a Christian pro-business movement grew from the bottom up as well as the top down. She shows how this region of the country, Northwest Arkansas, that is not on the radar, or was not on the radar in the 1950s and 1960s of any economic planner on Wall Street, how nevertheless a tremendous amount of economic innovation came out of that same Northwest Arkansas from Sam Walton and the creation of Walmart. How Walton, she looks at how Walton built this corporate globalization, and what she argues, and I'll quote her for just a minute here, she argues the American periphery, Walmart country, won the economic commanding heights in the second half of the century precisely by creatively mobilizing its regional disadvantages, turning necessity into invention, hostility to triumph. The populist critique of the industrial political economy provided the raw material for a new corporate populism, a distinctly Ozarks version of capitalism with broad appeal across the Sun Belt. At the same time, the region helped develop new circuits for the redistribution of national wealth out of the industrial north and into the pockets of the populist's own grandchildren scattered across Arkansas, Texas, and Oklahoma. So she comes at our subjects from this much more sympathetic way and forces us to kind of take a step back and rethink what we think we know about the nation's political economy in the second half of the 20th century. But she's not perfect. No historian is, myself included, as you're figuring out right now. What Morton leaves out is just as important. The Walmart economic revolution hurt as much as it helped the region that gave it its birth. The towns that got the Walmarts prospered. The town 5 miles down the road that didn't get the Walmart folded in on top of itself. I talk about this in my U.S. survey classes when I'm looking at economic globalization at the end of the century. And I grew up in one of those towns that did not get the Walmart. When I was a kid, my hometown had a 2-block long main street, and there were 4 or 5 grocery stores on this 2-block long street. There was a bank, there was a dentist, there was a doctor who would make house calls. Yes, doctors actually did make house calls at one point in time. There was a dry goods store, etc., etc., etc. Lots of businesses, and that whole main street is just falling in on itself. Nature is winning, literally, as abandoned buildings are covered with weeds and the like. Nature is winning. So what I want to do is try to figure out what else is happening, and I'm going to draw some examples from Texas, but not exclusively from Texas, as I look at places that get left behind and politicians who try to do something about it or not. So that's what I want to do, and I'm going to start by looking at an attempt to address income inequality from a private perspective, from a private philanthropic perspective. And then I'm going to move into the New Deal and look at arguments for government involvement in addressing poverty and income inequality. And then I'm going to look at a demagogic politician who said he was all about income inequality, but maybe wasn't. And then I'm going to complicate the story for liberal Democrats by looking at what happens in the 1960s to make it all that much harder for liberal Democrats to continue practicing the politics of Franklin Roosevelt. And I'm going to conclude by trying to figure out where we are today. So that's my real quick roadmap of what I'm going to do. I want to say something about voting, though, before I get started. We like to complain about the fact that our turnout rates for a presidential election that's highly charged are maybe 50%. For a city council race or a mayoral election, you know, we're lucky if we get a quarter of the voting population to turn out. Voting is the most basic act of citizenship, I think. And as the 20th century has progressed, there has been a fairly steady downward decline in the participation process in elections. Historians like to celebrate the late 19th century as the golden age of voting, when turnout rates were as high as 78% for presidential elections. And that statistic is true, but it doesn't tell us the whole story, because that 78% turnout is happening in the late 19th century when women did not have the franchise. So that's 78% of men, but it's not even 78% of all men, because even though the statistic is after the Civil War and after Reconstruction and after the 15th Amendment was ratified and added to the Constitution, the 15th Amendment really didn't do as much as maybe a real quick 30,000 feet flyover of the Constitution might suggest that it did for African American voting rights. If you listen very carefully to the language of the 15th Amendment, and I'm going to read it to you, pay attention to what it does and does not promise. So here's the 15th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Shall not be denied. It doesn't say the right to vote shall be protected. The right to vote shall be guaranteed. The right to vote shall be sacrosanct. It doesn't say anything positive and affirmative like that. It just says it will not be denied. And there's a little loophole there. It's not all that big, but it's big enough. And it's big enough that white Southern politicians were able to craft a whole host of very, very effective devices to prevent African Americans from voting in the late 19th and early 20th century. The poll tax, which if you were in arrears on your poll tax, not only did you have to pay the very small amount that was the poll tax, maybe it was only 50 cents, maybe it wasn't even that much, but if you hadn't paid the poll tax for 15 years, then you owed 15 years worth of poll tax. Maybe you had saved up enough to pay 15 years worth of poll tax, and you went to the courthouse to pay the poll tax, and you were told, sorry, this isn't the day we're taking poll tax payments. You're going to have to come back next Tuesday. And that's not quite all that easy to do with a rural agrarian economy and an employer who probably isn't all that keen on you paying poll tax to begin with. So there was that, and there were other devices that were developed to prevent African Americans from voting. It really takes the 1960s to change that in a meaningful way. Okay, that was my bit on voting. Private philanthropy. I'm going to tell you a story about a president and his wife and their private philanthropic efforts to deal with the problem of poverty and income inequality during the Great Depression. It's a positive and a negative story all at the same time. Herbert Hoover was elected to the presidency in 1928, promising a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage, that sort of thing. It didn't quite work out well that way for him or for the country, with the stock market crashing just months into his presidency. The Hoovers were wealthy. Herbert Hoover made himself a millionaire, and he was pull himself up from the bootstraps boy. He was not a trust fund baby. He made his own wealth for himself. He never worked for a paycheck after 1914, and he died in the mid-1960s. So he made himself that wealthy. They wanted a retreat outside of Washington, D.C. to go for short weekend vacations, that sort of thing. If you've ever been in Washington, D.C. in the summer, it can be as nasty and awful as Houston in the summer, walking around in the hot, wet blankets sort of thing, or living inside a dog's mouth is another quote that I've heard. So, you know, they wanted to go somewhere cool. And so they planned to build a retreat in the Shenandoah region of Northern Virginia, which is not that far of a drive from Washington, D.C. So they procured the property, and they go about building the property. And Herbert Hoover loved fly fishing, and so he's sitting fishing one day, and this mountain boy comes up to the President of the United States because he had read in the newspaper that it was the President's birthday. And so he came to give the President of the United States a birthday present. And it was a 15-pound possum that he had killed, which was a huge sacrifice. We laugh, but it was a huge sacrifice. That was a luxurious gift for this boy to give to the President of the United States. And the President started talking to him and wanted to know where he was going to school. And the boy, of course, had no school because there were no schools in that part of the country. And so the President's wife, Lou Henry Hoover, took it upon herself to raise the money privately, some from their own pockets, quite a bit from their own pockets, but to raise money from wealthy friends to build a school. And to build a school with a teacher who would be trained in working with an unschooled mountain population. And they did all of this privately and with as little publicity as possible. Because Lou Henry Hoover and her husband, Herbert Hoover, had the quaint, nostalgic, anti-modern belief that if you engage in a philanthropic act and then seek public acclaim for that act, it ceases being philanthropic. It becomes self-aggrandizing. They're right, but that's not how we practice philanthropy today. We go to the store and would you like to add $2 to your grocery bill for the whatever, and you know, you feel good when the cashier rounds up your credit card swipe, and you kind of feel like a heel when you say, no, sorry, I don't want to do that today. You know, all the way from that to all the other ways we engage in philanthropy. What they did worked for that community. And I play the what-if game. What would have happened if they had publicized what they were doing and inspired others with similar means to engage in building other schools? Because that's just one community in the greater Appalachian region of poverty. And that poverty ran all through southern Appalachia and other parts of the country. What would have happened if they had publicized what they were doing? It was a good effort. And for what they attempted, it worked, but it only goes so far, which I think is suggestive of just how vast the problem of income inequality was then and continues to be. Okay, now I want to move on to the New Deal proper, and I want to look strictly at Texas to do this. And you have to not think about the Texas that you know and live in today, because the Texas of the 1930s was nothing like the Texas of the early 21st century. It was rural, very rural. It was not urban. The major source of the Texas economy in the 1930s was agriculture. Oil's coming on the scene. It's a big deal, but it's nowhere near as big a deal as agriculture at that point in time. 2% of the population, and this is nationwide, 2% of the population controlled 28% of the wealth. This is in the 30s. The bottom 60% of the population shared 24% of the wealth. And if that sounds bad, it should, but the statistics for today are worse. And we're not in the middle of a Great Depression, which is frightening, except we are for some segments of the population. But it's hidden because we don't want to look at it. Okay, cotton and oil. Both in the 1930s in Texas suffered from overproduction. And that further drives the price down. And so the more you produce to make more money next year, everybody else is producing more, that drives the price down, and it's this negative spiral that does no good for anyone. By 1934, 13% of Texans were on relief. And between 1933 and 1936, and here's where we have a stark difference with today, the federal government spent $351,023,546 on public works and relief programs just in Texas. There was a tremendous amount of money being funneled into Texas for public relief. And you can enjoy some of the benefits of that by going to most any state park in Texas that is of a certain age. Chances are the infrastructure of that park was built with said funds. Many of our roads and bridges were also built with said funds. I would like for those roads and bridges to be replaced with more modern structures, but that's a whole other story. Okay, so that's a slight statistical view of what's going on in Texas, but words are just as important. A powerful member of the U.S. House of Representatives, Democrat Sam Rayburn, Texas only really had Democrats then, added up just how many citizens in his state and country as a whole were suffering from income inequality, and this is Rayburn. In the spring of 1933, we had 14 million people with hands willing to work for a living and to earn a livelihood for themselves, and those dependent upon them, but with no work to do. If you take the 14 million breadwinners and assume that the breadwinner has a wife and only one child, that would make 42 million American citizens whose buying power has been absolutely destroyed because they have no jobs. They have no earning power. You add to that only one class of people, and that is the people engaged in agriculture, and you have 33 million people who are selling their product of labor so far below the cost of production that their buying power was either destroyed or reduced to the vanishing point. And these two groups together, and you have 75 million American citizens, or more than 60% of our 120 million population that either have no buying power or have a very minimal buying power. Something had to be done. And Congress acted relatively quickly and relatively collaboratively. Not that there weren't arguments and not that there wasn't name calling, but comparatively speaking, they acted quickly and collaboratively with the president to put together a host of experimental programs to deal with the problem of income inequality. And they also studied income inequality from a regional perspective. Historian Walter Prescott Webb wrote in 1937 in the book Divided We Stand, The Crisis of a Frontierless Democracy, and he's talking about primarily Texas and the South here. He wrote, and I quote, "The economic imperial control by the North over the South and the West grew stronger as the political imperialism grew weaker by the readmission of the South after the Civil War and the admission of the West. Webb believed the North had extended its own economic conquest over the other two sections, giving it ownership not only its own section, but a controlling interest in the South and the West." So he's talking about a colonial economy and the fact that the South and the West had abundant natural resources, the oil and the cotton in Texas, but not a very large manufacturing infrastructure to convert said natural resources into wealth. And so without the industrial production, there are also no industrial jobs that pay better than picking cotton, etc. So that is what he writes about. President Franklin Roosevelt recognized that problem. In 1938, he declared, "It is my conviction that the South right now presents the nation's #1 economic problem." But it's not just the South's problem, it's the nation's problem. We have an economic unbalance in the country, and we have to fix it for the sake of the South and for the sake of the country, because if we remain economically unbalanced, we will all decline. It's the argument Roosevelt made. And he commissioned a study to look at what economic disparity in the South meant for the region. The report came back pretty quickly with 15 different categories of analysis, looking at inferior education, scant industrial production, poor soil, poor health care, insufficient access to credit. I'll give you an example on that credit point there. In state banks in Texas, and there were probably more state banks, certainly in the rural areas where more people lived than there were national banks, state banks in Texas charged an interest rate of 10.43% on loans that one took out. Whereas if you happen to live in New England or the Mid-Atlantic region at that same point in time, you could get a loan at 5.75%. So your interest rate in Texas is almost double just because you're poor and living in Texas. So what does that do to your chances? If you have a good idea, you want to bring industrialization to Texas, you just need a startup loan. We didn't talk about startup loans in the 30s, but same concept. What would you do? Well, maybe you would vote for this fellow who ran for governor of Texas in 1938, because he certainly sounded like he was the friend of the downtrodden. You've maybe heard of him, probably haven't. W. Lee Pass the Biscuits Pappy ODaniel was an Ohio transplant to Texas. And he worked for the Burris Mills, which was a flour producing company, and he was pretty quickly put in charge of advertising for the Burris Mills. And so he decided the best way to advertise was to use the most modern media sources available, which then meant radio. We don't have television yet. And so he put together a radio program that was, the whole program was an advertisement for the flour, but it also had entertainment that was popular to rural Texans, who were the majority of Texans at the time. And it included a hillbilly band, the Light Crust Doughboys. And Bob Wills, if you're into swing music, and you're probably not, but if you are, Bob Wills was one of the members of the Light Crust Doughboys very early in its existence. Well, in 1938, Pappy ODaniel tells the radio audience, you know, I've been thinking maybe I ought to run for governor. He's not a politician. He's a businessman with zero experience in politics. And not very much knowledge, although he suggests that he has that knowledge. I think maybe I ought to run for governor. Y'all send me a postcard, tell me what you think. He's overwhelmed with postcards. So he announces he's running for governor. And this all seems like it's just random, it just happened. He went on the radio and said, maybe I'll run for governor. He actually had, you know, he's a businessman. He has a bunch of businessman friends who are wealthy, who understood that he was popular with the masses, and they suggested that he run for governor. And what these businessmen want to do is they want to wipe as much of the New Deal out of Texas as possible, because Texas then had a fairly liberal governor who was not going to be running for re-election. And so they want somebody that they can control in. And Pappy ODaniel had as his campaign platform the 10 Commandments and the Golden Rule. And he said that he would put a generous system of old age pensions into effect. That never really quite happens. And he says he's against the sales tax, and he actually supports something akin to a sales tax. So he was a demagogue who said what the masses wanted to hear and did the opposite. He got himself promoted to the U.S. Senate in a special election in 1941, in part because he said he had all this evidence of fifth column activists in the state of Texas. Think Axis spies for Nazi Germany here. And so he says he has all this evidence. And that and a bunch of vote stealing, because, you know, we did that in Texas then quite well. We were good at it. So that and a bunch of vote stealing gets Pappy ODaniel to the U.S. Senate in 1941. He said that he was interested in doing something about the poor, but he was really interested in doing something about Pappy ODaniel. Okay, I'm going to fast forward to the 1960s and talk about how the politics of income inequality for Democrats gets much more complicated when Democrats take on a more pressing problem, and that's the problem of civil rights, or the lack thereof. Lyndon Johnson becomes president through the tragic death of John F. Kennedy, and he pushes ramrods through Congress the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Johnson is a candidate for election to the presidency in 1964 in his own right, and he wants to win an election, a landslide bigger than FDR in 1936, which would have been the biggest landslide ever. He wants to win and win big, and that would mean carrying the South. The same white South that's not real happy with him because on July 2nd he signed the Civil Rights Act into law. They're not real happy with him. Johnson's wife, Lady Bird, an activist, successful politician in her own right, says, okay, I'm going to go campaign in the South, because what we need to do is we need to tell the white Southerners that we respect them, and we need to go respectfully ask for their vote, because if you're going to be president, you need to be president of all the people, even the people who don't like you, and you need to ask them for their vote in a respectful manner. So she puts together this train trip through the South, the whistle stop, and she goes into the belly of the beast. I mean, she goes to rural Alabama. She goes to places where they're not going to be real happy with her, and they weren't real happy with her. There were, from 1960s perspective, some pretty ugly signs and chants and yells condemning her. She talks about the need for people to live together harmoniously, but she also talks about what Democrats have done for the South in terms of income inequality. And she gives the statistics about the average national wage at the time, which was something like $2,000 a year, and the average wage in the South, which was something like $1,700 a year, something like that. And she says that under Kennedy Johnson, the average wage in the South has increased about 20, 30 bucks. You may be mad, and the subtext of this was, you may be mad at the Democratic Party, and you may be mad at my husband for signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But you got to keep your mind focused on the economy. And the economy is prospering under Democrats, and you don't want to risk it not prospering by voting for Barry Goldwater. That's her argument. Johnson makes an argument that's pure Johnsonian. I like to make this argument in part because I want to provoke students to think a little bit, and because I want to push back at the Obama is a socialist, or when I was teaching in the 90s, Clinton is a socialist business. I want to push back a little bit about that, but the whole U.S. political system, and this has bearing on income inequality too, the whole U.S. political system has shifted rightward since the 1960s. I was going to my right, I should do this because that's your right, stage left is stage right, or something like that, from high school drama days. And I make the argument to students that Lyndon Johnson was the most liberal president the country has ever had, and I make the argument that the last liberal president was Richard Nixon, the guy who followed him, you know, the Republican who got drummed out of office because of Watergate. Nixon was a liberal only in that Democrats controlled Congress and they passed a whole bunch of domestic reform legislation. Nixon didn't care about it. He cared about foreign policy. So Nixon's an honorary liberal in my assessment there. But listen to Johnson, because he was the last president who talked about the poor as subjects, not objects. He's the last person to talk about poverty as in programs that he wanted to do and wanted to prioritize for the poor. And this is just a little bit of Johnson from a speech he gave in North Carolina in May of 1964, but he used this rhetoric over and over and over again. He says, in the last 2 weeks, I visited 9 states in the Appalachian area. I've seen 2 kinds of people, those who have a chance to earn a decent living and those who don't. There are a lot of people in this country who deserve a better chance. There are more than 30 million people living below the poverty line. They deserve a better break. There's a difference between being poor and being in poverty, a big difference. Many of us grew up poor. Here's Lyndon Johnson with the violins. I was born the son of a tenant farmer who was also in the state legislature. But Johnson liked to play up his own poverty, but that's Johnson. While we were poor, we were not prisoners of poverty. We were not caught in the backlash of an industrial revolution as the people of Appalachia are today. We had a chance to break out. And what he's talking about is his desire to build a great society where everyone has a chance to break out of poverty. I'm going to get to some of my favorite parts of Johnson in this speech. He says that some people are trapped in this poverty because of where they live, the part of the country they're from. They just happen to have the misfortune of being born into a poor region as opposed to a wealthy region. Others are poor because of the color of skin that they were born with. Some people can't make it out of poverty because they're in farming and agriculture is not doing well. And he goes on with this. And he says that what we need to do is find a way to free these 30 million people from the prison of poverty. We can only do it with your help. We need to lift them up, build their spirit, and make it possible to open the doors of American prosperity to all. FDR talked about 1/3 of a nation ill-clad, ill-housed, and ill-fed. Let's move it to 10% in the next 10 years and 5% in the next 5 years. And then let's wipe poverty completely from the face of the United States of America. Johnson really believed that that was possible. He said, think what a glorious feeling it will be and what a great land we will have when every child can grow up and have an education, where every child can have food for his body and clothes to cover his back, a roof over his head, and be his own keeper and earn from the sweat of his brow what he needs to provide the essentials of his life. Johnson talked a lot on the telephone, and he talked about taxpayers versus tax eaters. And he wanted to make people into taxpayers, not tax eaters. And his Great Society was an all-encompassing program with funding for education from the very basic level all the way through college. If you go where I teach to the University of Houston, so many of our buildings were built in the 60s, those buildings in 70s, those buildings that were built with Higher Education Act money are ugly, real ugly, but they serve a useful purpose. They have the classrooms where students can come and learn. And so he wanted to do all of that. Was he successful or not? Johnson, there were a couple of things that worked against Johnson's success. One is me and the mic. It took this long for me to fight the mic. I always fight the mic when I give one of these talks. Johnson, in part, has trouble because the Democratic Party is beginning to divide under Johnson's presidency. We won't really see the full effect of that until the 1970s, but it's beginning to divide over his biggest accomplishment, his biggest legacy, and that's civil rights. It's beginning to divide over that, so that's part of his problem. And the other problem, and this is a quote from Johnson, I hope it's okay for me to say this, but Johnson was Johnson, that bitch of a war is killing the lady I really love, my great society. So inflation started taking off in the 1960s because of the funding for the unnecessary, tragic war in Vietnam, and that makes it much harder to continue to fund the Great Society. So what happens? Why is it that we haven't really had a president since Johnson to prioritize poverty? The answer to that question is complicated. First, liberalism has been in decline since the end of the Johnson years. So that plays a role in it. I like to say liberals from the 1970s onward have been like 15-year-old kids trying to figure out what they want to be when they grow up and haven't quite gotten there yet. They've never quite been able to present a compelling narrative to both win an election and win the governing cycle that follows the election. Second, and I think more important, were the economic shifts of the 1970s. Deindustrialization, the moving of manufacturing out of the United States overseas where workers were cheaper. Soaring interest rates. So friends of mine who got their PhDs and started teaching in the 70s and bought houses in the 1970s, especially toward the end of the decade, probably had interest rates on those houses 15, 16, 17, 18%. Imagine paying a mortgage with 15, 16, 17, 18% interest on the note. It's not easy. Those soaring interest rates, soaring inflation, rising unemployment as a result of the deindustrialization created a tremendous insecurity among the blue-collar working class who, by the 1960s and 70s, before all of this, had become decidedly middle class. You could be middle class without a college degree. You could be middle class with an industrial production job at a GM plant in Flint, Michigan, until they were all closed, until Roger Smith closed all of the plants. And you could survive on the wage of one person. That's kind of tricky because the need for a two-income family happens at about the same time the feminist movement is in full form, and women who want to work outside the home are rightfully claiming the right to work outside the home. And so for some women, for professional women, it's a proactive choice to get a job outside the home. But for other women, the preference would have been to stay at home and be a mom at home like their moms had been. And the economic shifts of the 1970s made that increasingly difficult for women who would have preferred to be a homemaker, but could not because their families simply could not put food on the table without a second income. So that's something else that's going on. And then with the decline of industrialization in the United States, we have the development of a bimodal economy, one that is in part a service economy and one that is in part a knowledge economy. And the workers in the service economy are themselves bimodal. There are the very well educated service economy workers like Professor O'Rourke and myself. You know, we have PhDs, we did all that sort of stuff. We're service workers. But so is the person at the drive-thru at McDonald's. And the service economy produces more lower paying jobs than not, and some of the higher paying jobs are harder and harder to come by, at least in academia. So there's the service economy, and there's also the knowledge economy. And the knowledge economy is almost exclusively highly paid individuals. And chances are, if you're well-paid service economy worker or knowledge economy worker, you probably don't know anyone in the poorly paid service economy. You probably live in a neighborhood with people with a similar income as yourself. You probably, if you go to church, you go to a church with people in a similar income range with similar political views. You probably don't know or talk to anyone who has walked a radically different path in life. So these are all things that I think make it harder to talk about the poor. And it became politically necessary, I think, for politicians to talk about protecting the middle class, because the middle class was ever more tenuous 70s and on with the high interest rates, the high inflation, the high unemployment, et cetera. You had to talk about protecting the middle class. So the poor, for Ronald Reagan, become welfare queens. That's not flattering. Reagan put out the notion that women just have babies and go on welfare so they can buy Cadillacs. Thinking that people want to be on welfare was sort of the image that Reagan was putting out there. Or you have Bill Clinton's efforts to eliminate welfare as we know it by requiring work to get assistance, which was a little more complicated than that, because how do you get a job if you are a single mom and you have small babies at home? You know, where do you put the babies when you go to work? That's kind of a problem. So it's always more complicated than the politicians think. So I'm going to conclude with a question that cannot be answered, at least to an academic satisfaction, at least on this day, or for at least another 2 or 3 decades. Why has the real estate developer, Donald Trump, a multi-billionaire, trust fund baby, proven to be so immensely popular with a mainly white, middle-aged male, on the economic periphery audience with a style of right-wing populism? At the same time, the socialist, Bernie Sanders, proven equally popular with younger voters with his left-wing populism. We could, the chances are better for Mr. Trump than they are for Senator Sanders. Mr. Trump's chances have taken a dip this week, but never count Mr. Trump out. I've learned that so far this season. We could, in fact, see a presidential election with a supposed Republican running against a supposed Democrat, neither really within their respective parties, with right-wing populism running against left-wing populism. I doubt that it will happen that way, but I suspect the chances are better than not that one of them will be on the ballot this fall. What does this tale of 2 candidates tell us about the intersections of income inequality with politics in the early 21st century? And that's a question to think about, for which I don't have a perfect answer today. We can't, we're living through it. But I will stop with that and take any questions that you have, if you have any.